Good morning to you all, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our GNF session titled Towards a Formal African Space Program. My name is Asanda Sangoni. I'm the Space and Stakeholder Liaison Specialist at the South African National Space Agency. With me today, I have 4 esteemed panelists. Right, close to me is Dr. Valmon Sami from SANSA, from the South African National Space Agency. I have Dr. Francis Chizea from the Nigerian Space Agency, NASTA. I have Prof. Ade Abidian from the, he's a retired space expert. And then I have Mr. Feti from the African Union Commission. Now, as we all may be aware of the developments that have taken place in the African continent, more specifically within the African Union, where we've seen the development of an African space policy and a strategy, and we've heard of the establishment of an African space agency through the host country, Egypt. Now we may all be wondering what Africa is really up to, and our panelists today will give insight into that. Now our panel today will go as follows. We will have a keynote address from the African Union Commission. Then there will be a Q&A session between myself and the panelists, and then a Q&A session between yourselves and the panelists. Now, please allow me to welcome on stage Mr. Feti from the African Union Commission, who will give a keynote address. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen. I represent the Director of Human Resources, Science and Technology at the African Union Commission, Dr. Mahama Wadrago, and his keynote speech goes as follows. Ladies and gentlemen, we are gathered here today outside our capitals to reflect on our journey of space and to capture the vision of where we are going. It gives me great pleasure to address this gathering, convened with the theme Towards a Formal African Space Program. It also gives me an assurance that the International Astronautical Federation's efforts at connecting all space people will indeed be a reality in the near future. That space should be the channel of inclusivity and indeed the realization of space for the benefit of all humanity. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to congratulate all of our institutions in the space sector for the success stories that African countries are making. Today, Africa is a healthy, growing satellite market. From 1998 to 2019, Africa launched 35 satellites, among which 32 national satellites into orbit, launched by 8 countries, namely Algeria, Angola, Egypt, Ghana, Kenya, Morocco, Nigeria, and South Africa. 1 regional satellite entitled RASCOM, jointly funded by 45 African institutions for regional SATCOM operations, and 15 were launched in the last 4 years. By 2024, at least 15 African countries would have launched at least 1 satellite into space. And these countries would include Ghana, Algeria, Angola, DR Congo, Egypt, Ethiopia, Ivory Coast, Kenya, Mauritius, Morocco, Nigeria, Rwanda, South Africa, Sudan, and Tunisia. By 2024, African countries would have launched 64 satellites, representing an increase of 83%. And other countries are developing their national space policies and strategies, whilst regional economic organizations are doing the same. Ladies and gentlemen, many of us would remember very well the African journey for a continental outer space program. In fact, most of you have accompanied us since the beginning, and you have put tremendous efforts in the realization of an African outer space program. for the benefit of those who are hearing this for the first time, the African Outer Space Program's journey started in 2012 when the ministers in charge of science and technology in the 55 member states of the African Union decided on the need to develop an indigenous space network and formed a working group for this activity. The working group was tasked to look at optimizing the benefits from different space initiatives, minimizing fragmentation and duplication, as well as to develop an African space policy and strategy. The African space policy and strategy were adopted by the Summit of the African Union Heads of State and Government in January 2016, thereby formalizing this program. At the January 2018 summit, the statute for an African Space Agency was also approved, and a formal process was initiated to identify a suitable host for the African Space Agency. At the last AU summit in January 2019, the African Union Heads of State and Government approved the selection of the Arab Republic of Egypt as the host country for the African Space Agency. I wish to thank all of you who were part of this achievement, starting specifically with Dr. Val Munsami, who chaired the working group. We should all count ourselves among those who have offered Africa the most important tools of development. And I dare say so with confidence, because space is the genesis of major innovations in the world. As a matter of fact, many inventions have resulted from space spin-offs. The African Space Policy and Strategy, which are currently in display at the exhibition, explicate where Africa wants to be in the space arena. They give an indication that Africa is gradually capable of being a global player in the space economy. The African Space Strategy focuses on 4 main areas: Earth observation, satellite communication, navigation and positioning, as well as space science and astronomy. The strategy is to create a well-coordinated, globally competitive and integrated African outer space program that is responsive to the social, economic, political and environmental needs of the continent, and to develop a regulatory framework that supports African space advancements while positioning the continent as a responsible, peaceful user of outer space. We intend to do so by developing programs, missions, and space services that are user-centric, creating an enabling environment for our countries to access space services, nurturing the space market in Africa, and adopting a robust governance framework for coordination of African space activities. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a universal reality that space thrives through collaboration and cooperation with similar-minded entities. Therefore, while we harness intra-African collaboration, we should also join efforts with international partners who have gone ahead of us, perhaps through a similar journey, and identify areas of mutual benefit. The endeavor of African space programs is to thrive on a win-win situation. We would all reckon that when we fail to be part of international missions, such as the International Space Station, we fell out of the global space advancement. And this should not repeat itself. Otherwise, we deny ourselves the opportunity to develop our technologies. Today, the African space dream has come of age, and our countries should be able to be at the negotiation table with concrete proposals to leapfrog the continent to the next frontiers of space technology. I have no doubt in my mind that if we as African countries put the required efforts into the African Outer Space Program, then emerging technologies that will fuel the fourth industrial revolution and quantum technologies are within our reach. Moreover, we should not be left out in the important engagements such as space resource utilization. Ladies and gentlemen, the new space era has brought a revolutionary paradigm shift. Indeed, satellites can be developed in less than 2 years and cost less than a house. They can be deployed as constellations and are driven by commercial investments. Therefore, any nation, including emerging countries, can become leading players and easily afford space. In the same vein, we're hoping that African internet connectivity issues can be fixed with new space technologies such as the OneWeb satellite constellation and the Starlink, as well as DataCube and CubeSat, will shortly facilitate access and optimize the utilization of increasing availability of digital Earth data and services. In addition, Africa is presenting the biggest asset any continent currently offers. 60% of the African population is made of young people. To transform this asset to a competitive and differential advantage, human capital development should be one of the key priorities of all our countries. Ladies and gentlemen, I therefore invite you to accompany us in the next steps of realizing an operational African outer space program. The African experts will be gathering again in December 2019, that's the end of this year, in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, for the African Leadership Conference on Space Science and Technology, ALC. And I believe this is an important platform to concretize the next steps for the African Outer Space Program. I know the organizing committee will be inviting you, but as a partner, the African Union Commission seizes this opportunity to invite you to be part of this important Congress. It is my sincere hope that as we engage in this global networking platform, our resolve to develop and propel a thriving African space agenda will even be stronger. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Feti, for that. And with that being said, I'd like to pose a question to the representatives from the agencies as well as the Prof. What are your reactions to the African space policy and strategy? What are your reactions to the establishment of the agency? Do you think that Africa is ready to provide solutions for Africa by Africans? Prof.
No, I think Val, who has chaired the African Space Working Group for the AUC, should be the first speaker on that question.
Thanks, Ade. So from an African perspective, I'm not even sure the question should be whether we're ready or not. I think we're actually late in terms of implementing a space program. And the reason I say that is the motivation factor for setting up the working group, developing the policy and the strategy, was actually based on the recognition of the value proposition of space for the African continent. If you take the work of the African Union Commission, okay, and if you look at the various objectives and the kind of work that they do, more than 90% of what the African Union Commission engages in requires space science and technology. So in effect, the African Union Commission cannot even do their work without space science and technology. I also made an example a few days ago where I said that if you take India, China, US, and the whole of Europe, you still don't make the landmass of Africa. And a lot of the problems that we're dealing with in Africa, climate change, health, water issues, they transcend national boundaries. So the scale of the problems that we're dealing with is not local, it's regional. And the only way you can crack those kind of problems is through satellite platforms. So I think it's without question that we actually do need a space program in Africa. And I think that's why we're embarking on this journey.
Francis?
Well, I agree totally with Val. This had been a major requirement in Africa. But the problem had been, how do we bring ourselves together? Well, thank God, under the platform of the ALC, with the AU, being able to bring out Africans to come and talk and put in place required policies that will guide an African program. It is long overdue.
Thank you. Prof.
For me, I just want to add the following. When we talk about African space program and African space policy, we are talking of a collective effort. So if we are going to then gauge how that will come about in the immediate future, I think the first thing we need to do is to reflect back. And forgive me because somebody says, don't look back. I have to look back because I have over 30 years of working with that back experiences that I'm taking to the future. What have we done with ECA? What have we done with the regional centers in Nairobi and Ile-Ife? What have we done with the UN centers in Nigeria and in Morocco, and so on and so forth? That's number one. Number two, I am excited about the young people and the new technologies and how many of them are doing. And I foresee the future where the young Africans of today will be able to participate in winning Nobel Prizes in S&T in the future. The question is, are they able to do that which makes them excel in Africa, or do they have to go abroad right now? And you discover that most of what is happening is that most of these kids are going abroad. So I agree with everything in the space policy, as Val has articulated. I was party to it. He was our leader, or he's still our leader. But for me, what is in the document is theory. It is the practice that I'd like to see, as has been happening in all the programs the African countries have been organizing or holding. If you hold a space agency, who's going to pay for it? When you look at all the programs we are running today in Africa, everything is funded from outside Africa. And in the year 2000, when I was working in Nigeria, and we were talking about the Nigerian space program, I said at that time that Nigeria wants to go to space, God be with us. But please, 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 don't expect outsiders to fund it, only to give you the capability that will enable you to compete with them in the economic future that all of you are going to be running around. So if we can take all of this into consideration and work them out and give opportunity to adequate education in our universities and research institutions, bring the youth to participate, and encourage the private sector to grow rather than everything being given to foreigners to develop, we'll be there someday. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. And thank you for alluding to funding. My next question goes to you, Mr. Feti. The statute of the African Space Agency decides that it will be the African Union that will fund the agency. Are you able to elaborate on how this, how we expect this to happen? And are we expecting a similar model to the ISA model, or anything of the sort?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll pick up where Professor stopped. I'll pick up from there. Actually, there's been a big vacuum in terms of funding African developmental programs, not only in terms of space, but in all other areas. And the African Union is changing that model so that member states, African countries themselves, will be responsible for financing our developmental programs. And space being a flagship of the African Union is not an exception to this rule. So what's going to happen? The 55 member countries of the African Union are going to provide funding. In fact, they've committed budgets to provide funding for the African Space Agency. Now, in terms of figures, I may not be able to provide anything accurate for now, because the structure and operational scope of the agency is still under study and consideration by the African Union at the level of the summit, at the level of heads of state. We're hoping next January, when they convene again in Addis, they will approve the structure and scope. And there and then, we will see a very clear picture as to what the budgetary implications of the African Space Agency in terms of capacity, resources, and operation would look like. But I can assure you that this is a purely Pan-African program, and African countries, African leaders are committed to taking care of the funding themselves. I can assure you that.
Okay. That being said as well, then how do you see the respective national agencies then contributing to the African program, considering that they have their own national mandates? How do you see this happening? Val and Francis?
So I think if you interrogate the African space policy, it's very clear, because even in terms of infrastructure and activities, it says that we're not going to replicate what already exists. We're going to bootstrap what national space programs are doing. For example, there's a few countries like South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, have a satellite assembly, integration, and testing facilities. Now, when you set up an African space agency, you're not going to build that facility. It's there in Africa. So as opposed to building new infrastructure, sweat and leverage what currently exists. So there's a recognition that we need to use what's happening at the National Space Program and to bring that up into the African continent. But you have to also recognize that there's 55 African countries, and there's only about 8 countries you can safely say that are actually space-enabled. But how do you ensure you have a level playing field? So that's where the African Space Agency needs to come in and play a coordinating role in terms of using what already exists, but also bringing it to the other countries that don't have the capabilities.
Anything to add, Francis?
Well, yes, the funding part of the African Space Program was a major area of debate during the working group session. We already know the way the African Union is being funded, using the GDPs of each country to fund that. And the status of the African Space Agency, which is supposed to implement the African space policy and strategy, had to be a major thing we had to look at. What model do we use? Right now, from the approval is an organ of the AU, and the funding comes in from all member states. And we took into cognizance the fact that many of the member states don't even have a space program as of today. And how do you make them contribute towards a program, such as the space program? Many of them still don't even agree to the fact that they do need a space program. So it's a complex issue. I would wait to finally be able to add more to that after the meeting in January, when the head of state approve the structure or the final structure of how the funding of the agency is going to be. However, like Val said earlier on, we took into cognizance a lot of capabilities that we have already in Africa, and looking at how we pull it together as one to ensure that we don't spread ourselves too thin. South Africa doing the same thing as Nigeria, Ghana doing the same thing, whereas we could probably focus on various areas and be able to bring them together as a full component at the end of the day. I would like to stop there.
Okay, has a continental capability study been conducted on all the activities that are there in the national space agencies?
I think that was on the cards. So we started off looking at it from an Earth observation perspective. And so there was a study done in terms of what are the Earth observation capabilities in the country. But I think in terms of process, we didn't go into the next steps in terms of looking at from a navigation and positioning, communications, and telecommunications. Space sciences. But I do understand that the African Union has commissioned some studies on the side around these areas as well. Maybe Adiato can explain.
Yes, Val is right. What we did was a survey of the presence of space institutions, entities working in the arena of space around the continent. You wouldn't call this a study on capabilities. So I think we need to take 1 or 2 more steps to qualify the study as one looking at the capabilities of African countries in terms of space. But this is, a very major survey that actually was able to garner a lot of information and statistics on, the presence of space-related entities and organizations within the continent. But again, we hope to be able to launch in the not too distant future another study that will take us to the level of examining continental capacity in terms of space.
Yeah, I don't represent any government here. I only represent the non-governmental organizations. And for me, I have the African Space Foundation, and there are other organizations that are in this room that are NGOs. Now, I think when you talk about what the governments in Africa are going to do, I'm saying what are the NGOs that are related to space are going to do. And I can only speak about my own foundation, which I believe needs to work with the other foundations or similar entities in Africa to do a few things. And these are, if I read from my notes, to provide awareness and knowledge generation and acquisition and their relevance in what we are thinking of. To provide to encourage and generate interest in public and private investment in infrastructure and organizations, and to help in the dissemination and application of knowledge. Now, if we can sell these ideas to all these, our bosses that are on the seat with me here, in the entities they represent, Africa will go a long way. Believe me, Africa will go a long way. But we were talking to them. Actually, we are here today because one or two of us sat down with them in Addis Ababa. And that's the question I want to, because I don't know whether you plan to answer that question. Why are we talking about an African Space Agency today? And we are doing so because at a time, over 10 years ago, Africans were looking for an African space policy from Europe to be implemented in Africa. And some of us ran down to Addis Ababa. What is wrong with you? What is wrong with you? You have how many? In Nigeria alone, you have about 140 universities. Similarly in South Africa, similarly in Egypt, and all the other countries. What are you doing with African talents? You open the gate for them to be going to Europe and North America? When are you going to use your own people to generate some ideas and see how they can use their talents, not only for the international community, but charity begins at home. Let us start helping Africa first. And that was what led to the founding of the African Space Union Working Group that Val is heading, okay? And we need to be making that noise more in the corridors of power, beginning from Addis Ababa and in all the other capitals. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof, for that. What is the role of the regional economic committees in the African Space Program? Val.
Thanks for throwing all the difficult questions my end. So you have 55 African countries. So let's go back to how the working group was established. There were 10 member states represented in the working group. So Africa is divided into 5 regions. It's Southern Africa, North Africa, East and West, and Central Africa. And we had 2 countries per region represented in the working group. And that was to ensure that there was regional representativity in the working group itself. And then if you look at the policy is very clear, the space policy. It says that in terms of implementation, we take recognition of the national space programs, but we also have to look at it from a sub-regional and regional perspective. And in the policy itself, it articulates a role for the regional economic communities. So at the moment, we are currently also working on a space strategy for the SADC region, which is Southern Africa, and that's 16 countries in Southern Africa that are sort of grouping together to say, how can we collectively work together in this region to bring space to this region and address, and I think we have to be very careful the focus of a space program should not be that every country, 55 countries going and building satellites. It's just impractical. The focus should be on downstream applications in terms of Earth observation, telecommunications, navigation, because that's where the value proposition in terms of socioeconomic benefits lie. And so I think that's where the focus should be in terms of driving. But how do we use those countries that already have the technology and the capabilities to help assist in delivering those products and services? So we're looking at it from a sub-regional perspective, and then also bringing that capabilities into the region or the continent itself. So that's the modality in terms of the thinking. National space programs contributing, regional economic communities contributing to a regional agenda.
Thank you, Val. Are there any questions from the audience? Yes, I see one there. Thank you.
Thank you. Idris Al-Hadani from Morocco. First, I would like to congratulate the members of the panel for this interesting discussion. I'd like to raise 2 or 3 issues related to this debate on the African space program or African space policy. What is your appreciation concerning the fact that we have established an African space policy strategy 3 or 4 years ago, but there is no visibility for the future? There is no milestones that are already established. This is the first fact. Second fact, we consider that in this debate there are 2 important stakeholders that are not present. First is industry in Africa, or startups or something like that that are not associated with this debate. And the second is university. And I think that those 2 partners are very important and are crucial to develop any kind of activities related to space in the continent. If we do not develop these 2 components, I think we'll waste a lot of time before starting to do something operational in this field. Third element, we see, for example, from the presentation of the representative of the African Union, that there are lots of countries that are launching satellites in space. They have in specific programs. And I think this is a very curious situation. How we see that more than 30 or 35 countries have programs of satellites. At the same time, there is no connection with the African space program. And I think this should be considered seriously, why those countries are launching programs and there is no reference to the space program. And last element is we also witness a lack or absence, total absence of bilateral cooperation in Africa. I think if we target to set up a space African program, we should start by developing bilateral cooperation, regional cooperation on this field. And another element that I would like to share with you, that we have been witnessing a lot of initiatives in Africa debating the space program, but my feeling is there is a disconnection between all this initiative. This is the African Leader Conference, this African dialogue with stakeholders in space activities, etc. But I think there is no coordination between these actions, and this is harmful for the development of space activities in our country. Thank you.
Only facts, so I don't know if... Yes, Prof.
Yeah, let me touch on what Mr. Hadani, my friend from Morocco, has just articulated very well. Yes, when the AUC presenter made the presentation this morning, he reminded us that Africa is already in space because we have 35 satellites. The question is, why does Africa want to get involved with space? That question has to be answered satisfactorily. For me, I've heard a lot about to improve our economic development. But for me, it is the impact of space in the well-being of the common person, man, woman, old or young. If it is not making any impact, then you are not doing anything. So the question that is necessary for us, maybe I'm going to ask my AUC brother here, to get the African countries that have satellites, to get their countries to respond to that question. All these satellites you have put in space, can you let us get a neutral body to evaluate the impact of your investment in the well-being of the people in your community? Because I know Australia doesn't have much of any satellite in space, nor Sweden, but they are having a lot of benefits. As Val said earlier, the downstream, and if we understand the downstream, that experience will ginger us and serve as an input into developing new capabilities and new systems that can go into space. But if we don't understand the downstream application, we are going nowhere. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we've run out of time, but we thank you very much for being our wonderful audience. Thank you very much.